There is a particular kind of light that falls over Legos in the evening. Gold, forgiving. The kind that makes even ordinary things look like they belong in a memory before they've finished happening. That was the light over the Echo Hotel Gardens the night of our engagement party. The light I stood under when 300 guests drank champagne to a future that had already quietly ended without my permission. I did not know that yet. I only knew that the sky was kind to us that evening, and I mistook its kindness for a blessing. I remember thinking, foolishly, that I had never been more proud of anything in my life. The gardens had been dressed in wine and gold, her colors, chosen without asking mine, though I hadn't minded then. I had wanted, more than anything, to give her a night she wouldn't have to compromise on. Fairy lights threaded through the frangipani trees like something out of the films she loved, the ones where love always arrives cleanly, without residue, without a single loose thread left hanging for someone to pull on later. My mother wore lace she saved for this exact occasion, touching my arm every few minutes as if she needed to keep confirming I was real, that her son was truly about to be a husband. "You did well," she whispered, her eyes wet before the ceremony had even properly begun. "God has been faithful." I believed her. I believed all of it. The lights, the laughter, the small speech I'd rehearsed in the mirror that morning until the words no longer sounded like my own. The ring already resting on Ava's finger as though it had always belonged there, as though her hand had been carved with its exact shape in mind. I stood at the entrance greeting uncles I didn't recognize and aunties who pinched my cheek and called me husband before I'd even earned the title. And I let the words settle over me like something sacred, something I hadn't learned could be counterfeited. I did not know that sacred things can be counterfeited, that a room can hold you applauding while somewhere in its corners the truth is already being spoken in a language you haven't learned to hear yet. I did not know that a party can hold two entirely different stories at once, the one everyone is toasting to, and the one quietly unfolding in the spaces between the toasts, where no one is watching closely enough to notice. It was during the toast that I noticed Ava was gone. Not dramatically, she hadn't stormed off, hadn't given anyone reason to whisper, she'd simply drifted. The way water finds the lowest point in a room without announcing that it's moving, without a single ripple to mark its passing. I searched the crowd for her gold aswebi, for the particular way she laughed with her whole throat when she was happy, and found nothing but strangers holding drinks and the low music of a live band playing highlife covers no one was really listening to. My father's cousin was mid-toast, glass raised, saying something about how marriages built on friendship outlast marriages built on fire. I remember nodding along, distracted, already scanning the tent for gold I couldn't find. I found her by the drinks table, near the edge of the tent, where the fairy lights thinned into shadow, where the party's noise softened into something more private, more forgivable to whisper in. She was not alone. Daniel. I knew the name the way you know a scar on someone else's body, abstractly, without having witnessed a wound that made it. An ex. Nothing serious. He wasn't ready. I had filed it away the way you file away weather reports for a storm that had already passed, the kind of information you keep only because forgetting it entirely feels careless, not because you expect to ever need it again. But storms don't always pass. Sometimes they only retreat, gathering themselves just past the horizon, waiting patiently for the right night to return and remind you how small your shelter really was. They were laughing, not politely, not the laugh of old acquaintances catching up at a party, trading updates about jobs and cities and mutual friends. This was a private laugh, low and easy, the kind built from 100 inside jokes I would never be told, a language assembled over years I hadn't been present for. Her hand rested on his arm the way it rested on me when she wanted to steady herself against something, a habit I had thought belonged only to me, a small intimacy I had never once seen her extend to anyone else. He said something I couldn't hear, and she threw her head back, gold earrings catching the fairy lights, and for one unbearable second, she looked more alive than she had all evening standing beside me at the altar of our own celebration. I have replayed that second more times than I can count. I still don't know what hurt more, the laugh itself or the ease of it, the absence of performance. With me, even her joy sometimes felt rehearsed, generous but measured, like a woman careful not to give away more warmth than a moment required, as though warmth were a currency to be spent wisely. With him, she gave it freely, the way you only give things to people you've never had to be careful with, people you've already forgiven in advance for whatever they might do wrong. She saw me before he did. The laugh didn't stop immediately. It faded, the way music fades when someone lifts a needle from a record, a half second of sound still hanging in the air after the silence has technically begun, an echo outliving its source. Her eyes found mine across the tent, and something crossed her face that I told myself that night was surprise, and only later understood to be something closer to inconvenience, the specific irritation of being caught mid-sentence in a story she hadn't finished telling, a woman interrupted before she was ready to close a chapter she hadn't admitted was still open. "Old friend," she said when I reached them, too brightly, too quickly rehearsed for a sentence that should have needed no rehearsal at all. "You remember me mentioning Daniel?" I extended my hand. He shook it. His grip was confident, unbothered, the handshake of a man who did not consider himself in competition, because a man only competes for something he believes he might lose, and something in his ease told me he did not believe that, not about this, not about her. He looked at me like you look at a placeholder, politely, without threat, the way you'd regard a chair currently occupying a seat you already know will be yours again eventually. "Congratulations," he said, gesturing vaguely at the tent, the lights, the entire architecture of the evening we had built for months. "She's lucky." I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say. Not "you're lucky," not "what a beautiful couple," "she's lucky," as though the luck belonged only to her, as though I was the fortunate circumstance and not a man who had built an entire future out of choosing her, brick by careful brick, month after month. I turned the phrase over in my mind long after he'd said it, like you turn over a stone in a riverbed, unsure what you're looking for until your fingers find the sharp edge hiding beneath the smooth surface. I let it go. That's the particular tragedy of men who love too loyally. We specialize in letting things go, smoothing over jagged edges with the flat of our own patience, mistaking our restraint for maturity when really it is just fear wearing a calmer face, fear dressed up in the language of grace so it doesn't have to look at itself too closely. I smiled. I made a joke about the band running out of fella covers. I steered Ava back to the tent, my hand at the small of her back, proprietary in a way that I would later be ashamed of, as though touch alone could reclaim territory that had already been quietly ceded to someone else's history. "Are you okay?" I asked her, once we were back among the lights, among people who didn't know a single thing had shifted beneath their feet. "Of course," she said, too fast, adjusting an earring that didn't need adjusting, the small tell of a woman buying herself a second to compose an answer. "Old friend, I told you." I nodded. I did not argue. I did not have the evidence to argue with, only the low, cold hum of instinct, the kind that arrives in the body before the mind is ready to receive it, the kind I would spend the next 3 weeks trying to unhear, telling myself I had imagined a chill where there was none. The party continued around us. Toasts, laughter, my father's cousin singing off-key to a song from his own wedding decades ago, the kind of joyful noise that usually makes a man feel anchored to something larger than himself. I smiled through all of it. I held Ava's hand through all of it, her fingers cool inside mine, her ring catching the fairy lights every time she lifted her glass. But some small watchful part of me had already stepped outside the tent, already standing at a slight distance from my own life, observing it the way you observe a photograph you suspect has been altered but cannot yet prove, certain something is wrong with the image, unable to say exactly where the retouching begins. Later that night, after the last guest had gone and the fairy lights had been switched off one string at a time, I sat in the car outside her flat while she gathered her things from inside, and I found myself staring at the frangipani trees through the windscreen, their blossoms pale and indifferent in the streetlight. I thought about the ease of that laugh. I thought about a man's hand resting where mine usually rested, comfortable, unhurried, as though I had done so 1,000 times before and would do so 1,000 times again. I told myself I was building suspicion out of nothing, the way anxious men sometimes do the night before something they've worked hard for. I told myself love makes men suspicious of shadows that aren't really there, that a party is not a courtroom and the laugh is not a confession. That night, lying beside her, I stared at the ceiling fan, turning its slow, indifferent circles, and thought about the sound of that laugh, the one she'd given so freely to a man who was apparently only an old friend. I listened to her breathing even out into sleep beside me, peaceful in a way that struck me, even then, as slightly unfair. How easily some people sleep beside the questions they've left unanswered in someone else's chest. I did not yet know that 3 weeks later, standing in a hallway with warm chin-chin cooling in my hands, I would hear the rest of that sentence, the one the party had only begun, the one that would finally give shape to the shadow I'd spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself I hadn't seen. I did not know that ease between her and Daniel that night was not nostalgia, but rehearsal. A woman quietly keeping a door unlocked while she let me believe I was the only house she lived in. Public betrayal, I would come to understand, does not always happen in public. Sometimes it happens quietly in gardens strung with fairy lights, in laughter given freely to someone who was never supposed to matter anymore. And the only witness is the one man in the room still foolish enough to believe he'd already won. I stood in that tent surrounded by 300 well-wishers. Not one of them saw what I saw. Not one of them heard what I heard. Sometimes the loneliest moment of a man's life happens in the middle of the loudest celebration anyone will ever throw for him. A room full of applause, and only one heart quietly beginning to understand what it was about to lose. There is a photograph from that night that my mother still keeps on her shelf. Ava and I beneath the frangipani arch, her head tilted toward mine, my hand at her waist, both of us caught mid-laugh at something the photographer said to loosen us up. Every time I visit her house, I find myself looking at it a second too long, searching the edges of the frame for something I know isn't there, because the camera was pointed the wrong way that night. It was aimed at the version of us the world was meant to see, not the version quietly unraveling near the drinks table, 40 feet and one lifetime away. I think about the band too, how they kept playing through it all, oblivious, their trumpet bright and certain, filling the tent with a joy that belonged to everyone except for, in that moment, to me. I think about how music can go on entirely unaware that it is providing the soundtrack to someone's undoing. How a high life tune written to celebrate can just as easily accompany the exact second a man's certainty quietly begins to crack down the middle, like the first hairline fracture in a windshield that will not fully shatter for another 3 weeks. My father found me near the edge of the tent not long after, refilling his glass, unaware of anything except his own contentment. "Your grandfather would have loved this," he said, clapping my shoulder, his eyes bright with a pride I didn't yet know how to carry. I smiled and thanked him and said nothing about the conversation I'd just witnessed, because what was there to say? That I'd seen my fiancée laughing with an old flame? That a stranger had called her lucky in a tone that suggested I was the consolation? That some quiet animal part of me had already begun pacing the perimeter of a danger I couldn't yet name? Grief, when it is still only a suspicion, has nowhere polite to go. So I folded it small, the way you fold a letter you're not ready to send, and tucked it somewhere behind my ribs, where it would wait patiently for 3 more weeks to be read in full. Ava found me again before the night ended, slipping her hand into mine as though nothing had happened, as though the last hour hadn't left a residue only I could feel. "Having fun?" she asked, resting her head briefly against my shoulder. And for a moment, I let myself believe her, let myself believe that the ease I'd witnessed by the drinks table was nothing more than old friendship catching up on old times, that I was simply a man exhausted from months of planning, seeing shadows where the fairy lights had merely flickered. I chose belief that night. I chose it deliberately, the way you choose a bridge you've already started crossing, because turning back feels more frightening than the possibility that it might not hold. It held that night. It held for 3 more weeks, in fact. Long enough for me to stand in fitting rooms and taste cake samples and rehearse vows in front of a bathroom mirror, believing every promise I was preparing to make. But bridges built on things unspoken rarely hold for long. And mine was already groaning quietly beneath a weight I hadn't yet allowed myself to name. A debt that would come due without warning in a hallway that smelled faintly of chin-chin and cost me everything I thought I'd already secured. Driving home alone that night, windows down, the last of the fairy-like glow still clinging to my rearview mirror, I passed a church with a signboard that read, "What is hidden in the dark will be shouted from the rooftop." I remember laughing quietly to myself at the coincidence, the way you laugh at a warning you don't yet believe applies to you. I did not know that night how literally those words would come true, that the shout waiting for me wasn't thunder or scandal, but something far smaller and far crueler. A woman's careless voice, low and amused, 3 weeks away, telling a friend the truth I'd already have heard in a garden full of fairy lights and refused, for my own sake, to fully understand.